Today's section on arrays is the kind of for day one slash intro session on arrays. And so because of that, I understand that I might be going through it a bit fast, but also a lot of this may be repetition for most of you. So that's why. But obviously, if at any point you do feel like there's something I'm saying that doesn't make sense, definitely stop me. Just shout out, right? When you use chat, it's a little bit tricky for me to undo the presentation mode. Um, the other thing is because we're doing 2 days on arrays, today's may seem more introductory, but that's just because we're teeing up for some of the more complex array methods that you'll be seeing tomorrow in part 2 of the arrays block. Okay, cool. So just move this output here. Okay, great. So arrays. Arrays are a very common data type that you'll see in JavaScript. They are complex, which means they can be changed. And so the most common way to think about changing an array is, hey, if I have a list of 5 things, I can always just add one more thing to it, right? And now I have 6 things. And so because I am able to customize arrays, or rather edit or mutate arrays, that means it's a complex data type. And more often than not, you'll hear people compare arrays in JavaScript to things like lists, right? And essentially, that's what it is. A list is a collection of different things. But the other thing that makes a list very important, or sorry, one feature of an array or a list that makes it very usable is in a list, just like in an array, we have a sense of order, right? So there is a first thing, there is a second thing, there is a third thing, right? Like there's an order in which things happen. And we'll see once we get into the topic on objects how that may not be the case for other data types in JavaScript. So very quickly here, if I look at the array on line 3 there, very simple, right? The syntax for an array is basically it starts with an open square bracket and ends with a close square bracket. Every single thing in that list or every single thing in the array is what we call an element, and every element is separated by a comma. So on line 3 there, we have the numbers array, which is an array of 3 elements. Each of those elements is a number. And then on line 5, once again, we have another array, and the value of each element is a string. And notice how each element, once again, is separated by a comma. Finally, we have just to complete the circle, an array can actually hold any data type that you want. It can hold numbers, booleans, variables. And as we'll see later today, it can also hold other arrays as well, right? So it's basically a nice catch-all way for you to capture and sort different variable or different value types into a list. Cool. So one of the things that we've talked about so far is using type of to determine whether or not something is a number or a string or a boolean. The problem here is that when we do type of and then we put an array after it, you'll notice that type of actually returns object. And the reason for this is a bit more complex, but the more simplified version is just that in JavaScript, an array is actually an object under the hood. But because arrays are such common data types, what JavaScript does is JavaScript actually takes an object, adds special features into it to actually make it operate like an array, right? So all of this is just to say that if you want to figure out whether or not something is an array, using type of would not be your best method, because if I use type of, then the problem becomes, well, now when I look at it, it could either be an object or an array. I actually don't know what it is, right? So the proper way, or the most precise way for us to test whether or not something is an array, is to use what we call the isArray function, or the isArray method. And the way for us to simply do it is we'll call this function array.isArray, and we pass in the variable or the value we're trying to test. And array.isArray will only give back one of 2 possible values. It will give back a true if the thing we're testing for is an array, and it will give us back a false if the thing is not an array, or if the element or the variable or the value is not an array. Notice how, once again, right here in the beginning, we see how the A in array is capitalized. So this just means that we're using something that belongs to the array class, right? Because remember how on day 1 we talked about how when you capitalize the first letter in a variable JavaScript, it usually means you're talking about a particular class. So we have had some experience with classes so far when we did our session on coercion. where if I was to say if I take the number class and I pass in anything, it will try to convert it into a number. Here I'm accessing the array class, and just and we'll talk about methods more. But here all we're saying is the array class has a method that's called isArray, and whenever we call it and pass it in a value, that function will just tell us, hey, true, this is an array, or false, this is not an array. Okay, any questions so far? Are we good? This is hopefully a lot of this is, even if it's not something you already knew, it should be hopefully very intuitive, kind of how we're approaching this. Okay, so next thing we're going to talk about how to access arrays. And once again, this is something that we've kind of already seen when we did our session on strings. And actually, one of the things you'll notice is that a lot of the ways that we access and edit arrays are the same ways in which we access and edit strings. So in terms of access, we access arrays through something called bracket notation. Here on line 7, notice how I have the names. Sorry, on line 5, I create the names array, and on line 7, I do the names. I take that variable names, and I put a bracket after it, and then between the brackets, I put in a number. In this case, I put 0. That number just tells you what position we're looking at inside the array. Every element, remember on the very first slide how I mentioned how every element in arrays has an order, as in there is a first element or a second element, etc. That number is basically determined by the index, right? And in this case, every single element in the array has an index, right? It has a position. And the indexes for arrays start at index 0. So the first element is at position 0. The second element is at position 1, and so on and so forth. So on line 7, when I say names index 0, that just means give me the first element, or the element at position 0 inside the names array. Similarly, on lines 10 and 11, I'm asking for the element at index 1, so the second element, and then the element at index 2, or the third element. On line 13 there, notice how I'm asking for the element at index 3, which is actually the fourth element. However, if I look at my array only has 3 elements. So on line 13, I'm essentially asking for a variable that does not exist, or a value that does not exist. However, when I run that in JavaScript, rather than throwing back an error at me, what it actually does is it actually gives you back an undefined value. And the reason for that is because JavaScript at this point just says, hey, something doesn't exist there now that you're trying to access, but theoretically it could, right? And so this is just more of an acknowledgement that what you're looking for could exist, but it does not currently exist. And so the bigger thing to kind of be aware of here is that just if you're trying to access a variable in an array that does not, sorry, if you're trying to access an index in an array that does not exist, you're not going to get an error, right? You are going to get an undefined. And in some ways that could be more dangerous, right? Because if you get an error, your code kind of stops and you can kind of figure out what happened. Here in this case, you don't get an error, you get an undefined value, and you try to use that, well, maybe that will cause an error, but essentially it's just like kind of one more thing to just be careful of. And so if we know how to use bracket notation to access elements based on their position, then for us to assign a value or to replace a value, it is simply as just adding an equal sign, adding the assignment operator to it, and then putting in whatever it is you're trying to assign, right? So on line 6, names index 0 just says, hey, for the first element in the array, and then equal Washington means override that value with the string Washington. And we're doing the same on line 8, right, with the second element, and we're overriding John with Adams, and then similarly with Jefferson. Okay, so very straightforward. In the same way that we read elements, if I just put an equal sign and a value after it, then I'm overriding or reassigning that value. And so here, once again, we can just kind of go back and just kind of really drill in this idea of the difference between an array and a string, right? In some ways they're very similar, but this is one way in which they're not. If I take a look at line 7, I have an array with the word brace, B-R-A-C-E, broken up. And then on line 8, I have the string equals B-R-A-C-E, brace, right? On line 10, if I set array index 0 equal to G, so I try to change the first element to a G. On line 11, I also say take a string index 0, and I try to change the first character to a G as well. When I console log out both array and string, notice how in the array, the G was successfully changed, right? We were able to change the first element in the array and override it with G. However, nothing happened with the string, and that's because, once again, arrays are complex, which means we can change them, but strings are primitive, which means we cannot change it. And so this means for that string, we can never change any of the letters or add new letters. If we do want to write grace, then we need to create a brand new string. Okay, any questions up to here? You guys can hear me, right? Can someone shout?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. All right.
Well, I do have a question.
Go ahead.
Is there ever going to be instances where we have to access the individual characters of the element in an array, and how would that work out? Like, do you have to just build that extra code?
Yep. We'll talk about it when we talk about nested arrays, right? And the way we access nested elements is similar, whether or not something is an array or a string. So we're going to cover that. I think either later today or probably first thing tomorrow. Yeah. Cool. All right, so that's assignment. So now, basically every time we use an array, right? An array, if you think about it, it's a data type, but there's also a lot of things we do with that data type, right? If I think about a list, if I was to make like a list, what are the things I want this list to be able to do? Well, I want to be able to add things to it. I want to be able to take things off of it, etc., right? And so one of the benefits of using a data type that's already been pre-built into JavaScript is that not only can you use it for that purpose, but it also comes with a bunch of really handy tools that can help us that are commonly used that they've already built for us, and hopefully can make our lives much easier going forward. So if I take a look at the first thing, right? The first thing we're going to take a look at is dot length property. Every array has a dot length property. So if I just make an array with the brackets and then I do that array dot length, that will always give me back the length, right? Or how many elements are in the array. Okay, and that comes built in every time I use every time I make an array, I can rest assured that array will always that array dot length will always give me back a number indicating how many elements are in the array, even if that length is 0, right? So if I have an empty array and I do that array dot length, then I just simply get back 0. So I am guaranteed to always receive back a number whenever I use an array's dot length property. However, sometimes it may not just be to say, hey, tell me some information, right? Sometimes we actually want to use these methods to be able to do something. So one of the most common things that if I was to give you a list that we want to be able to do is, well, I want to be able to add more things to my list. And so the first method we're going to take a look at here is the dot push method. One thing I just always want to differentiate whenever we talk about array methods is there's 3 different things to consider, right? One is, what is the array doing? Okay. 2 is, does it change the original array? And then 3 is, what does the function actually return? Right? If you think about the functions that you've written, right, a lot of times the function is actually very complex, right? If I give you a string and I ask you to capitalize every other letter, if I look at just the output, I can say, oh wow, cool, like that was successful. But I actually don't know what you're doing kind of inside the function. And so in the case of arrays, it is important to know whether or not we're changing the original array, and then also what it gives back to us. So when I look at that push, on line 4 there, I have an array called names with, once again, three names. On line 6, notice how I'm saying let new length equals names.push James. What dot push does is dot push takes in one or more elements, and it adds it to the end of the array. And so now on line 8, when I look at the names, after I do names.push James, notice how my array now has 4 things, right? With James being added to the very end of the array. So, but when I look at new length, right, which is the value that's returned after I call names.push, what that actually returns to you is the length of the new array. And so if I was to kind of go back to the 3-point framework that I just described here, right? What does dot push do? Dot push takes in elements and adds them to the end of the array. Does it change the original array? Yes, it does, because on line 6 there, I see I call names.push, and when I console log out names on line 8, I see that the array has one more item. And then lastly is, what does that function return? Well, that function returns the length of the new array. Right, so in this case, it just returns the length of names plus 1 because I pushed in one element into it. Sorry, any questions on dot push? Cool. All right then. The next thing we'll take a look at is the dot pop method. Dot pop method basically allows us to be able to remove one element from the end of the array, and it also returns that element. So what does it look like in practice? Well, here on line 4, I have an array called names, and on line 6, I call names.pop, right? Notice how when I call .pop here, I don't put in any arguments. And the reason is because .pop doesn't require any argument. It doesn't need me to tell it what to do because by definition only does one thing. So if I call it, then, well, I better be expecting it to do that one thing. And so what it does is it actually takes the last element, it takes it out of the original array and returns it. So once again, if I go back to my three-point framework here, what does it do? It removes the last element in the array. Does it modify the original array? Absolutely, it does. And then lastly is what does it return? It returns back the element that just got removed. Dot shift then, so dot push adds things to the end of the array. Dot pop removes things from the end of the array. So now we're talking about how do we edit things from the very beginning of the array, right? And dot shift, once again, it works just like dot pop, except rather than removing and returning the last element in the array, dot shift actually removes and returns the first element in the array. Okay, so if I was to call this function on names, once again, notice how I don't put any arguments because dash shift only does one thing, so there's nothing for me to specify. And then when I look at names now, so going back to the framework from earlier, what does shift do? Shift removes the first element from the array. What does it modify the original array? Yep, it does. Notice how my names array is now only has 2 items into it. And then lastly is what does shift return? Shift returns back the element that was just removed from the beginning of the array. Ray, do you have a question?
Yeah. I thought that pop also did something. It when pop was used to like the most recently added item, like so. It
Uh,
was
Pop removes the last element in the array,
no
not
matter what.
not necessarily the most recently added.
Oh,
Because if I have a list of 5 things and I add something to the very beginning of my array, if I call dot pop will still remove the last element in the array, even if it was not the most recently added.
oh, okay. Then there's like a conflict in the pre-recorded video with this lesson.
Did they call dot push first and then they call dot pop?
Yes.
So in that case, if you call dot push adds something to the end of the array. So if you call dot pop after that, then yes, you will be removing the last element in the array, which happens to be the most recently added element in the array. But those are 2 distinct things. They may not always be the case.
Okay. Thanks for the
Yep,
clarification.
no problem. Any other questions? Cool. Well, then I guess just to kind of complete this, I don't know what you call a pack of fours, this quadrilogy. We talked about how to remove things from the end of the array, how to remove things from the beginning of the array, and then we also talked about how to add things to the end of the array. The last but not least, we're going to talk about unshift, which allows us to add one or more elements to the beginning of the array, right? And so very much just like just like dot push, if I call the array dot unshift and I pass in an element, what it will do is it will add the element to the beginning of the array. So that's what it does. Does it modify the original array? Absolutely, it does. And then lastly is what does it return? It returns back the new length of the array. So then in this case, if I have a list of 3 names and I unshift King George III, then basically adding the 4th element to the beginning of the array, and now my new array has length 4 because I've added one more element into it. Okay, so those functions are things all things that are around us being able to add and remove things from the array. Yep. Is there a question?
Yeah, sure. Can you use shape or unshape with more than one element?
Yes. So you are able. So, oh, sorry. So you are not able to remove more than one element with shift or pop. That only works for one element. So you can call it multiple times, but it only removes one element at a time. With regards to push and unshift, if you pass in more arguments, then those elements all get added to the beginning of the array. And so here, and when I call unshift, here I put, unshift on line 5 there. It's into unshift, I call King George the third. If I put a comma there and I put in the string David, what that will do is I will add both King George the third and David to the beginning of the array.
Um, Both of them will be a different element, or will be just considered as one element?
It will be multiple elements. So if I go here, and if I did, let ARR equals, I'll put in 1 comma 2, right? If I call ARR dot unshift and I pass in 3, right? And I return ARR here. Here you'll notice my array is now 3, 1, 2, right? And if I do ARR dot length, this will say 3, right? Because now my array has 3 things. If I put in another element here called 4, and I do ARR dot length, now my length is 4 because I've basically added 2 elements to the beginning of it.
Oh, cool. Thank you. Got it.
Yep. Cool. And it's the same exact thing for push, except you're adding to the end of the array.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. Thank you, Dave.
Yeah, no problem. Cool. All right. Yeah. Okay. Cool. So just a few more methods here. I know that there's a lot here, but when you're doing your workshop, I would definitely suggest you keeping these sides open just as a source of reference. Dot index of is also an array method, and it works just like the one for strings. If you're familiar with that, essentially dot index of is a search function, right? And what it does is, if here knows how I call names dot index of, and I pass in an element, and all index of does is it looks for an exact match with that element, right? Notice how I said is exact match. If, for example, here I only search for the string EORGE, I would never find a match because nothing in that names array matches EORGE, right? But if I do George, GEORGE, and it looks for an exact match, then it finds it. It finds it as a first element. And so what index of does is a search function. It will return back the index of the first match it finds. Okay, it tells you where location-wise it found the first match. The location is provided as an index, so it's a number, and index of searches from left to right. So even I have George multiple times in my names array, the only value that will be actually returned will be the first one that it finds going from left to right. Last but not least, if I search, in this case on line 7, if I search for an element that does not exist inside the array, then the function simply returns back -1 to say that, hey, there's no index, there's no match, rather we couldn't find a match for that element inside the array. So all dot index of is a search function. The next method we're going to take a look at is sorry. So if I go, sorry, just to wrap this up with a nice bow here, right? So if we go back to our 3 things here, what does dot index of do? It searches for an exact match for our input. What does it change the original array? It does not change the original array because all we're doing is looking through it, looking for something. And then lastly is, what does it return? It returns back an index of the match if it finds it, or sorry, it returns back the index of the first match it finds, or it returns back -1 if it does not find a match.
So, David,
Yep.
would index of work for the equal elements?
No, it has to be dot index of is an exact match, I believe.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we can check that though.
Not sure.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, with all these things, right? Like when I say something, it's just like, that's a good thing about code is that it's always checkable. There's very little ambiguities in most cases. So here, if I do dot index of and I search for 2, if it was a loosely equal, I believe it would give me back true. But here it gives back -1, which means I did not find it, which means it's looking for a strictly equal relationship.
Cool.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Just pull back. Okay, cool. All right, so that's dot index of. Okay, dot slice. Dot slice is another method, and what it does is, once again, if you're familiar with the string version of this, hopefully it's very intuitive. What slice does is slice just makes a copy of the array for you, right? And usually, what we're saying a copy is, is it makes a copy of either the entire array or just a subsection or just a part of the array. And so here, if I look at dot slice takes in two arguments. The first argument that it takes in is the index at which where to start. And so in this case, it's saying on line 6, when I do names.slice1, it basically says start at index 1. So if I look at names, index 1 is at John. That's where I start. The second number is basically saying where do I stop. But just be careful here because the second number is not where it stops, but where it stops right before it gets to that number. And so the way to interpret line 6 in the right hand side of the equal sign is to say, hey, make me a copy of names that starts at and includes index 1, but stops right before we get to index 2. Well, if I start at index 1 and I never reach index 2, then what I've really done is I've just copied index 1, right? And in fact, if I look at the return value there and I capture in the variable one-term precedence, if I look at the output on the top right-hand corner of my screen, I see that indeed what slice does is slice copied as part of the array, and it copied just the middle element, it copied just John. So dot slice will always give you back another array. It's just a matter of which elements in the original array have been copied over to this new array. Right, so just be careful there. Remember, the first number is where it starts, and that's inclusive. The second number is where it stops, but it's exclusive. And then last but not least, as a shorthand, a lot of times what people do is people just say they call names.slice, but they don't put any arguments inside of it. And when you do that, that's just a shorthand for saying, hey, can you just copy the entire array for me? And so on line 6 there, I create a variable called names copy, which I'm just doing is I'm just copying all of names. And now I can do whatever I want to names copy, right? Because it's a copy, it's not the original. And so on line 8, I take this third element there and I convert it equal to Paul. I add in Ringo as a fourth element. And when I look at the original names array as well as the names copy array, notice how the original array was not changed because I've now made a copy of the array, and all I've been doing is editing and playing around with the copy of the array. So what does .slice do? .slice copies a subsegment of the original array. Does it change the original array? No, it does not, right? Because it's only making a copy of a part of it. It leaves the original array untouched. And what does it return? It returns back an array that includes the copied portion of the array, of the original array. All right, 2 more, and then we're done, folks. One is .includes. .includes is almost like a more primitive, sorry, bad word. It's like a dumber version of .index of. All .includes does is it's also a search function, but rather than telling you where it finds the match, it just tells you if it found a match, right? So whenever you do names.includes and you're searching for something, it will only give you back a true or a false. True means it found a match, false means it didn't find a match. But unlike index of, it doesn't tell you where it found it, nor does it tell you how many matches it found, right? It's just saying, hey, yes, this variable exists, or no, this variable does not exist. And then last but not least, we have our .reverse method. .reverse method, as the name indicates, all it does is it changes the original array and just reverses the elements. Yeah, not much more to say it than that. What does it do? It reverses the element. Does it change the original array? Yes, it does. It actually modifies the underlying array, so be careful when you use it. And what does it return? It doesn't return anything, right? Because it reverses the original array. So if I want to look at my changes, I will look at the original array. .reverse doesn't return anything meaningful, I believe. And that's pretty much it for today, right? So, like I said, the first half of the lecture was probably very simple and kind of a review of arrays that hopefully a lot of you have already been dealt with, or have already dealt with, or are familiar with. And the second half are just a list of methods that are very commonly used with arrays that we want you to practice. In today's workshops, we'll be asking you to recreate a lot of these functions. Obviously, don't use these functions when you recreate it, right? If we say, hey, could you recreate .includes for us? Don't just say, oh, great, let me use the built-in .includes function, right? We want you to be able to build it from scratch so you can kind of so you can understand underneath the hood how everything works. Are there any questions?
Can you just repeat the three things to watch out for each of the methods?
Sure. For each method, the first thing is to understand what the function is trying to do, or what the method is trying to do. The second thing is that function modifying or mutating the original array, right? In the case of dot push or dot shift, I am changing the original array. In the case of dot includes or dot slice, I'm not changing the original array. And then the third thing is just be careful about what the function is returning, right? A lot of times, if especially when people use dot push, they don't care what the new length of the array is, so they use dot push, but they don't store the return value because it's like, why? I don't need it, right? On the other hand, if you use dot slice and you don't capture the return value, well, there's no point in using it, right? Because slice does not change the original array, and dot slice gives you back a copy. And if you don't store that anywhere, then you might as well have not have used it in the first place. So just kind of keep an eye out for that distinction. Any other questions? Cool. All right then. Oh, sorry, someone's chatted me a question. Oh, yeah, you can